Marcus Hale had risen to unite Liverpool's fractured gangs, while Ilir Vasko moved in the shadows, orchestrating a war that no one saw coming. In the streets between them, fear spread faster than bullets, and a city braced itself for a battle that would change everything. Subscribe and share for daily new update of gang crime story and watch till end. Liverpool had always carried two faces. On the surface, it was a city full of music, football pride, and crowded streets where life moved fast and loud. But beneath that energy, there was a quieter tension that most people chose not to see. Long before the gang war became public, the signs were already there. Late at night, police sirens became more common in certain neighborhoods, and emergency lights reflected off brick walls more often than before. These incidents were rarely explained in the news, dismissed as isolated events with no clear connection. Yet for those who lived close to the docks and older housing estates, the atmosphere had begun to change. Small street crews had existed in Liverpool for years, usually fighting over narrow areas and minor profits. Their conflicts followed unwritten rules, and violence was kept limited to avoid attention. That fragile order slowly began to break. Couriers started disappearing mid-route. Storage units were found empty without signs of forced entry. Cash stopped reaching its final destination, and no one knew why. The people involved understood that these losses were too clean to be accidents. Someone new was operating with discipline and patience, testing the city without revealing themselves. Fear did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, spreading through rumors and half-truths. Shop owners near the docks noticed unfamiliar men watching from parked cars. Old warehouses that had been silent for years suddenly showed signs of activity late at night, only to go dark again by morning. Even seasoned criminals sensed that Liverpool was being studied, mapped, and measured. The streets were no longer controlled by reputation alone. They were being evaluated like assets in a business plan. Police felt the shift as well, though they struggled to explain it. Reports increased, but patterns remained unclear. Victims refused to cooperate and witnesses vanished into silence. Officers began suspecting organized influence from outside the city, yet there was no name, no face, and no obvious leader to follow. Every lead ended the same way, with unanswered questions and growing frustration. As days turned into weeks, tension thickened. Local gangs became more aggressive, reacting to pressure they could not see. Minor disputes turned violent without warning. Areas once considered neutral became dangerous after dark. Ordinary residents sensed the change most clearly. Parents kept children indoors longer, businesses closed earlier, and conversations lowered whenever unknown faces appeared nearby. The city felt watched, as if something was waiting for the right moment to strike. By the time the first major incident occurred, Liverpool was already on edge. The streets knew that a larger force had entered the game, one that did not care about old rules or local history. The calm that followed each unexplained event felt unnatural, like the silence before a storm. Whatever was coming was calculated, patient, and far more dangerous than anyone was prepared for. The change became impossible to ignore as winter settled over the city. Cold winds moved through Liverpool's streets, and with them came people no one recognized. These newcomers did not arrive loudly or in large numbers. They blended into the background, renting small flats near industrial zones and spending long hours around the docks without drawing attention. To most residents, they looked like ordinary workers or recent arrivals searching for opportunity. But to those who understood the hidden economy of the city, their behavior felt deliberate and controlled. Unlike local gangs, these men avoided open displays of power. There were no flashy cars, no public confrontations, and no signs of reckless violence. Everything they did was quiet and precise. Vehicles appeared and disappeared at the same times each night. Shipments moved through routes that had never been used before. Warehouses once ignored were suddenly active for short windows, then locked and abandoned again. Someone had studied Liverpool carefully and was now moving pieces into place. The local criminal network felt the pressure almost immediately. Long-standing supply lines stopped working without explanation. Middlemen failed to show up, and payments arrived late or not at all. No threats were made and no warnings were sent. That silence was more unsettling than violence. It suggested confidence, as if the newcomers believed resistance would be pointless. Whispers spread through back channels about a foreign organization known for patience and long-term control rather than chaos. Police intelligence units noticed the same patterns but struggled to connect them. Surveillance footage showed unfamiliar faces, yet nothing illegal was visible. The individuals followed rules carefully, never staying in one place too long and never interacting with known offenders in public. Even when questioned casually, they revealed nothing useful. Their records were clean, their paperwork in order, and their movements legally justified. It was as if they had been trained to exist just beyond the reach of suspicion. The docks became the center of quiet activity. Containers were rerouted, paperwork altered, and schedules adjusted without raising alarms. Port workers sensed that something was wrong but could not explain it. Small mistakes began appearing in records, always minor, always corrected too late. By the time anyone noticed, the goods were already gone, replaced with empty space and unanswered questions. Local gangs responded with confusion rather than force. They searched for rivals but found none willing to claim responsibility. Meetings were held in secrecy, alliances tested, and old grudges resurfaced. Each group suspected the others of betrayal, unaware that the real threat was watching from a distance. This confusion worked perfectly for the newcomers, allowing them to expand without resistance. By the end of the season, Liverpool was no longer dealing with outsiders passing through. The city was hosting a permanent presence that had no interest in recognition. Control was being built layer by layer without violence or noise. The Albanian Mafia had not announced its arrival, but its influence was already woven into the city's veins, setting the stage for a conflict that would soon become impossible to contain. The first sign that the silent takeover had turned violent came without warning. One night, an entire supply route collapsed at once, leaving multiple crews cut off from money and resources. Vehicles that were expected to return never came back. Storage units were found unlocked and completely empty, yet nothing inside appeared damaged. It was as if the contents had been removed carefully, not stolen in a rush. The speed and precision of the operation shocked everyone who relied on those routes. By morning, rumors flooded the streets. Some claimed a new group was sending a message. Others believed an internal betrayal had finally surfaced. No one could agree on the truth, and that uncertainty fed panic. The loss was not just financial, it was psychological. Long-standing crews realized that their routines were exposed and their defenses meaningless. The sense of control they once had over their own territory vanished overnight. Within days, the consequences turned deadly. Abandoned buildings on the edges of the city became scenes of unexplained violence. Authorities discovered evidence of struggle but no clear timeline, no witnesses, and no usable clues. The locations were chosen carefully, far from cameras and public view. Each incident felt calculated, designed to spread fear rather than attract attention. The message was clear to those who understood the code of the streets: resistance would be punished quietly. Police response intensified, but progress remained slow. Investigators struggled to link the incidents together. The victims had few official records, and their connections led to closed doors and silence. Witnesses either claimed to know nothing or disappeared before follow-up interviews could happen. Even informants who had once been reliable stopped answering calls. Fear had reached a level where cooperation felt more dangerous than staying quiet. As tension rose, smaller gangs began making reckless moves. Some tried to protect what little they had left by striking preemptively at suspected rivals. Others went into hiding, abandoning territory that had once been defended fiercely. These reactions only added to the chaos. Violence that was once controlled and purposeful became unpredictable. Innocent areas were affected as fear spread beyond the criminal world. The newcomers remained invisible throughout it all. No public claims were made and no warnings were issued. That silence became the most frightening part. It suggested complete confidence, as if the violence was only a tool, not the goal. Each incident seemed to remove another obstacle, clearing the way for deeper control of the city's underground economy. By the end of that month, the streets understood a hard truth. This was no longer a battle over profits or pride. It was a campaign to erase the old order completely. Liverpool's criminal landscape had entered a new phase, one where power was taken without noise and fear replaced loyalty. The first blood had been spilled, and there was no path back to the way things had been before. As the violence unsettled the streets, the structure that had held Liverpool's underground together began to weaken. Long-standing leaders who once commanded respect now struggled to keep control over their own crews. Meetings ended without decisions, and promises of protection sounded empty. Every move felt risky, because no one knew who was watching or how much had already been compromised. Power no longer belonged to those who spoke the loudest or ruled by fear. It belonged to those who remained unseen. One local figure, Marcus Hale, attempted to restore order by reorganizing scattered groups under a single direction. His rise was sudden, built on strategy rather than reputation. He avoided unnecessary violence and focused on rebuilding lost roots and stabilizing income. For a short time, it seemed like the city might resist the pressure closing in on it. But each plan Marcus set in motion failed before it could take shape. Safe locations were discovered, transport lines were intercepted, and trusted associates vanished without explanation. It became clear that someone knew his moves before they happened. At the same time, evidence suggested a guiding hand behind the chaos. Police analysts noticed patterns linking incidents that seemed unrelated on the surface. Financial trails showed precision, with profits being redirected rather than stolen randomly. This level of coordination pointed to a strategist operating beyond street-level conflicts. Intelligence files began referencing a name that never appeared in official records: Ilir Vasko, believed to be a key organizer within the Albanian network. Despite increased surveillance, no confirmed image or location could be tied to him. What made the situation more dangerous was the psychological pressure. Gangs began turning inward, questioning loyalty and suspecting betrayal at every level. Trusted enforcers were sidelined. Longtime partners were cut off. Fear replaced unity, and isolation made each group easier to control. The invisible strategist benefited from this fragmentation, tightening control without needing to step into the open. Authorities faced similar frustration. Raids produced small arrests but no meaningful breakthroughs. Each operation seemed one step behind the real activity. By the time a location was targeted, it had already been cleared. Officers began to suspect leaks, but investigations found nothing concrete. The enemy was not just organized, it was patient. Liverpool's underworld was changing shape. Traditional hierarchies were collapsing, replaced by uncertainty and suspicion. Power was no longer held by those who controlled territory but by those who controlled information. Every failure reinforced the same conclusion: the war was being directed from a distance by someone who understood the city better than those who lived in it. As pressure mounted, the realization settled in that this conflict could not be won through force alone. The old rules no longer applied. The streets were no longer fighting an opponent they could see. They were facing a system designed to exhaust, divide, and quietly erase them. And with each passing day, that system grew stronger, pushing Liverpool closer to a breaking point from which it might never fully recover. The conflict had moved far beyond hidden deals and isolated violence, and its impact could now be felt across the entire city. Neighborhoods that once stayed separate from the criminal world were being pulled into its gravity. Small businesses near transport routes began closing without explanation. Owners cited safety concerns, but everyone understood the deeper reason. Fear had become part of daily life, shaping routines and limiting movement. Liverpool no longer felt predictable, even in daylight. Within the underworld, trust had almost completely collapsed. Groups that once depended on cooperation now avoided one another entirely. Shared resources were abandoned and long-used meeting points were left untouched. Every unfamiliar face was seen as a possible threat. Every delayed message raised suspicion. This breakdown worked perfectly for the unseen force guiding the chaos, as isolation weakened any chance of resistance. The rise of informants only made things worse. Individuals desperate to protect themselves began leaking fragments of information, often incomplete or misleading. Some provided names that meant nothing, while others pointed investigators toward people already on the edge of disappearance. These half-truths created confusion rather than clarity. Operations based on bad intelligence failed repeatedly, damaging confidence on both sides of the law. Law enforcement found itself overwhelmed by the scale of disruption. Resources were stretched thin and public pressure mounted as crime statistics climbed. Yet every major effort seemed to fall short. Seized locations revealed little more than empty rooms and erased records. It was as if the real operation existed one step ahead of every investigation. Analysts warned that the city was no longer facing a collection of gangs, but a shifting network designed to absorb pressure and redirect it elsewhere. Meanwhile, internal fractures deepened within the Albanian network as well. Though largely invisible, signs of strain began to surface. Financial transfers slowed. Certain routes stopped functioning without explanation. Subgroups appeared to be acting independently, no longer aligned with the larger structure. This fragmentation created unpredictable outcomes, increasing violence in some areas while leaving others eerily quiet. Control was no longer absolute, even for those who had engineered the takeover. Ordinary residents felt trapped between forces they could not see. Public spaces emptied earlier each evening. Community events were canceled quietly. Conversations became shorter and more cautious. The city's rhythm changed, driven by unease rather than energy. People sensed that Liverpool was turning against itself, pulled apart by fear and suspicion rather than open conflict. By the time officials acknowledged the full scale of the damage, the war had already reshaped the city. It was no longer about who controlled which street or route. The real cost was measured in broken trust, abandoned neighborhoods, and a shared sense of vulnerability. Liverpool stood divided not by borders or gangs, but by the uncertainty of who could still be relied upon. The conflict had reached a point where survival mattered more than victory, setting the stage for an outcome no one could predict. The turning point arrived quietly, disguised as a routine collapse rather than a dramatic explosion. What appeared at first to be a string of unlucky discoveries soon revealed a deeper pattern. Financial trails that had remained invisible for months suddenly surfaced in multiple investigations at once. Bank accounts linked to the underground economy were flagged, transport routes were exposed, and safe locations that had stayed hidden were identified almost simultaneously. The precision of these revelations made it clear that this was not the result of chance or improved policing. At first, suspicion fell on Liverpool's remaining local groups. Many believed a desperate insider had finally broken under pressure and decided to trade secrecy for survival. But that theory quickly unraveled. The information being uncovered was too detailed, too current, and too specific to come from outsiders alone. It reflected intimate knowledge of operations that only the highest levels of the network could access. The betrayal, it seemed, had come from within the very structure that had engineered the war. As investigators dug deeper, a disturbing reality emerged. The Albanian network was no longer unified. Hidden rivalries long suppressed for the sake of expansion had resurfaced under the strain of rapid growth. Control over profits, routes, and influence had become contested internally. One faction began leaking information selectively, not to destroy the entire system, but to weaken its competitors from the inside. The war that had once been framed as outsiders versus the city had transformed into something far more dangerous. This internal fracture destabilized everything. Operations that depended on strict coordination began failing. Deliveries arrived late or not at all. Trusted intermediaries vanished without warning. The silence that once signaled control now pointed to disorder. Violence flared unpredictably, not as strategy but as reaction. Each move risked exposure, and every exposure deepened mistrust. Law enforcement sensed the shift but struggled to capitalize on it. Raids increased in number and scope, yet they often landed between targets rather than on them. The leaking faction was careful, releasing just enough information to weaken rivals while protecting itself. This selective betrayal created confusion, making it impossible to tell which parts of the network were collapsing and which were adapting. For Liverpool's streets, the effect was immediate. Power vacuums appeared overnight. Areas once controlled tightly were suddenly abandoned. Smaller groups rushed in, only to retreat when control proved impossible to maintain. The war lost its structure, becoming chaotic and dangerous in new ways. Fear intensified, driven not by a single dominant force but by the absence of any clear authority. By the end of this phase, one truth became undeniable. The most damaging blow to the operation had not come from police pressure or local resistance. It had come from ambition turning inward. The betrayal no one expected had shattered the illusion of unity, exposing the network's greatest weakness. What followed would not be a clean victory or defeat, but a slow unraveling, dragging everyone involved toward an uncertain and irreversible end. The collapse accelerated faster than anyone expected. What had taken months to build began to fall apart in a matter of weeks. Authorities moved quickly, launching coordinated operations across Liverpool before the fractured network could reorganize. Locations that once felt untouchable were suddenly sealed off. Warehouses near the docks were cleared in the early hours, storage units were broken open, and financial assets were frozen without warning. The strikes were not random, they followed a map drawn by the network's own internal failures. The arrests that followed were quiet but significant. Mid-level operators who had avoided attention for years were taken in with little resistance. Many appeared exhausted rather than defiant, worn down by months of pressure and uncertainty. Yet the figures most people expected to see were nowhere to be found. The leaders who had shaped the conflict seemed to dissolve into the background, leaving behind only traces of their influence. Among the local side, the disappearance of Marcus Hale became the subject of intense speculation. Once seen as a potential unifier, he vanished during the final wave of operations. No confirmed sighting followed. And no evidence tied him to any arrest. Some believed he had fled before the net closed. Others suspected he had been removed by forces determined to erase loose ends. Whatever the truth, his absence symbolized the end of the old resistance. On the Albanian side, the mystery deepened further. The name Ilir Vasko, already shadowy and uncertain, faded completely from intelligence files. Surveillance turned up nothing. Financial trails went cold. Even the factions that had turned on each other stopped mentioning him. It was as if the architect of the operation had never existed, leaving behind only a system that no longer functioned without direction. The streets felt the change immediately. Violence dropped sharply, not because peace had been achieved, but because no one knew who was still in control. Areas once contested were left empty. Smaller groups tested the silence, then pulled back when no clear authority responded. The fear shifted again, this time driven by uncertainty rather than domination. The war had not ended with a clear victor, it had simply burned itself out. Police officials later described the outcome as incomplete. While major damage had been done to the network's infrastructure, the full picture remained elusive. Evidence suggested that parts of the organization had escaped entirely, taking knowledge and resources with them. What remained in Liverpool was a hollow structure, stripped of leadership and purpose. By the time the final operations concluded, it was clear that the conflict had ended in a way few had anticipated. There were no public trials that explained everything, no single moment that marked victory. Instead, the war dissolved into silence, leaving behind unanswered questions and a city trying to understand how close it had come to losing control completely. In the months that followed, Liverpool slowly began to breathe again, though the city was no longer the same. The streets were calmer and the constant sense of imminent danger faded, but it never disappeared completely. What remained was a quiet awareness that something vast and powerful had passed through, leaving marks that could not easily be erased. The absence of violence did not bring relief so much as caution. People moved forward but carefully. Official reports described the operation as a success, pointing to reduced crime figures and dismantled networks. Yet behind closed doors, investigators admitted that the picture was incomplete. Too many gaps remained in the evidence. Too many financial trails ended abruptly. Entire sections of the operation had simply vanished, taking their structure and knowledge with them. The war had ended, but it had not been fully understood. For local communities, recovery was uneven. Some neighborhoods reopened and rebuilt, determined to return to normal life. Others struggled with the damage left behind. Empty buildings stood as reminders of what had happened, their silence heavier than the noise that once surrounded them. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to restore. Even as daily routines resumed, people watched more closely and spoke less freely. The criminal landscape shifted rather than disappeared. Smaller groups emerged, cautious and fragmented, aware of how quickly power could be taken away. None attempted to fill the vacuum left by the fallen networks. The lesson had been clear and brutal. Control did not always come from strength or numbers, but from patience, planning, and invisibility. Those who survived understood that survival depended on staying small and unseen. The Albanian Mafia faded from public attention but not from speculation. Rumors suggested that parts of the organization had relocated, carrying their methods elsewhere. Others believed the network had simply adapted, choosing silence over confrontation. With no confirmed arrests of top leadership, the truth remained out of reach. The absence of answers became its own conclusion. Liverpool's authorities quietly adjusted their approach, focusing more on prevention and intelligence rather than reaction. The war had shown how quickly a city could be reshaped without loud battles or public declarations. It had also revealed how fragile stability could be when pressure was applied in the right places. These lessons were noted, though rarely discussed openly. Years later, the gang war would be referenced in reports and documentaries as a warning rather than a closed chapter. It stood as an example of how a conflict could erupt, escalate, and disappear without a clear ending. The city moved on, but the memory lingered in the background, woven into its modern history. In the end, there was no single truth, no final arrest, and no moment of victory. The brutal gang war that shook the UK ended not with